What's up? Firestar W here to talk about Pine, an indie open world game that I played through recently. Now, usually you don't hear about indie open world games. It's always, AAA, pretty saturated in that regard, looking back the past decade. But I saw a Gaming on Linux article about this game a year or so back. It had, like, Breath of the Wild in the title or description somewhere. I'm like, hey, this looks kind of cool. I'll put it on the Steam wishlist, check it out at some point. And that some point was the past week, so now I've played it. It has some things that I think were worth pointing out to a greater audience. Kind of stuck with me. So let's get into it. The reason I felt this game was compelling enough to do a video review for was sort of the short length compared to the typical open world game, an enjoyable yet typical craft and collect items experience, and the game's claim to fame that animal villages and all the systems that they entail. Before I talk about these strong points of the game, though, let me get into the main part of the game you interact with, the world. The world itself is okay, mostly just lacking a bit in density of interesting locations. It's not completely empty and repetitive, but it's not a game where you're gonna think, oh, what am I gonna find next? Every, few inches or so, sort of like a Breath of the Wild type world. Alright, and that just made me think of another thing. So I did mention sort of the Gaming on Linux article, sort of compared it to Breath of the Wild. A lot of other reviews and other things I've seen have compared it to Breath of the Wild. It's not Breath of the Wild. The closest open world game that I've played that it resembles is Far Cry. The game has won awards on its Kickstarter in 2016. It was in development all the way up till 2019, so maybe that kind of explains it. Sort of predated Breath of the Wild, just barely. But yeah, just want to get that note to the side. So transitioning away from the game comparisons, more like Far Cry and less like Breath of the Wild, this game has you just collecting items to craft upgrades to your sword, to your bow, to your armor. That's the main thing you're going to find throughout the world that makes it interesting. There are little puzzle areas, maybe you could call them like shrines from Breath of the Wild, but a little simpler and smaller than that. They're less frequent in the game, unfortunately. But they do give you nice rewards when you do find the few that are in the game and complete them. The game mostly seems to rely on the villages, sort of, to make the game world interesting aside from just the ingredients you find. But on a visual perspective, it still kind of falls flat. There's only a few villages that have truly, unique designs to them. The rest are sort of copy-paste based on the faction. Additionally, there's lots of areas that are just roads that only have resources on the side. That's sort of what I'm getting at, on how resources are really the interesting thing that you're going to find in the world. Additionally, other land features such as caves, interable buildings, islands are not really present or used well in this game's overworld. Caves exist, but they're really only there to be used in quests, not to hide any cool items or enemy encounters. The experience of walking around in this game will mostly be just looking for orbs, the main collectibles in the game, and occasionally finding the puzzle area. Those are the two sort of highlights of you walking around. The game just really isn't set up for exploration, sort of like a Breath of the Wild. Map markers in this game are needed though. It does have sort of, you need to keep track of things idea to it, but unfortunately the map markers are limited. You only have different colors, there's no different icons, can't put text for it, so it gets really hard to keep track of, and they always show up in your compass thing too. It's definitely an area though where copying Breath of the Wild would help. Just give me different looking icons, give me something. And lastly, speaking of Zelda, you're not really going to find any dungeon type areas either, just puzzle focused areas. Despite what you can say is missing from this game's overworld, it's still interesting to walk around. As I mentioned before, the main draw is going to be finding those resources, that one item you need to get that upgrade, as well as finding all the different villages and interacting with them. So now instead of dancing around just interacting with the villages, I'll actually explain what all that is. So this game's claim to fame is the 5 different animal factions. There's foxes, caribou, lizards, crocodiles, and turkeys, I guess. And you'll pick whichever one of those is your favorite, or 2, or 3, if you really try hard at the game. And then you can build affinity with those 3 that are your favorites. So They're just little bars that go up and down. They like you, they're neutral, they hate you, and they will fight you. The only real way to make them go up and down is to just donate them items. There may be other actions that affect this, but the game doesn't really show or explain it. The only noticeable thing is just giving them items to make them friends or foes. Making them foes is more of if you give a different animal faction an item, then it makes everyone else hate you. Whenever an animal tribe is your enemy, they will fight you on sight. They are your enemy, as I did say. They are neutral, they will not fight on sight, and you can walk around their villages unscathed. And finally, when you're friendly with them, you can also trade with them in these villages. It can save you from needing to grind for resources, and nets you some unique items and crafting recipes for each tribe as well. The fact that the items and crafting recipes are unique by tribe encourages you to attempt to befriend all the different animal factions, which is kind of nice. It makes you do more. While allied, you can also raid other tribes' villages with your allied tribe, fighting to take over a village. Finding your favorite animal, allying with them, taking over one of all the other villages. One of the best things about this game. You can even build up villages you take over. However, the game doesn't introduce this concept and tell you can do that until the very last mission of the game, leading you to really barely utilize this. This could have been done a lot more. The village buildings, kind of the funnest aspect. Note that all the interactions will also be done by tribes on their own without player interventions, meaning that tribes will be changing hands constantly throughout your playthrough, which makes the world feel a bit more alive and adds some sort of differences between one person's playthrough to another. You could even be in the middle of a village that's being raided and intervene if you want. In my case, the tribe I allied with and helped took over most of the villages in the game pretty early on. I also single-handedly took out a caribou village early on, which weakened them to the point where for most of the time in the game, they only held one village. The village system does have its shortcomings, however. The only thing really to do in villages is trade. You can talk to other NPC villagers, but you'll see the same lines really quickly. The only way to direct villagers to fight with you is with the Raid Flares item, which calls them in a group after a delay. You can't walk with an army to another location or direct them to areas by pointing to them on the map or something. They only fight tribes that are hostile as well. It eliminates any cool spying or betrayal potential. It even makes some quests later in the game a pain. You just need to be enemies of the tribe and you can't just go up and fight them to make them enemies. I could really see how a game that's just about taking over the world with one tribe of animals, maybe making that a game mode, would be really fun. This is just these tribe systems, animal tribe systems, villages, they're definitely the highlight of the game. Well, the villages and honestly exploring the world, despite the world's shortcomings I did describe, are the best things in the game. There are some other things that, left me with more to be desired. So one of the biggest things I noticed was traversal in the world itself was pretty lacking. My favorite open world games, Breath of the Wild, Dying Light, they have different movement options for you. You can use a glider in Breath of the Wild, motorcycle, teleporting horse. Dying Light, all about the parkour. It's got a grappling hook. This game has mounts. You can have sort of a horse, but the way the game's structured, you might actually never wind up being able to use the horse, basically, and the horses don't even feel that good to use. What winds up happening in this game is all you can really do is run forward. You can run forward faster with a potion you can use, but that's about it. Interestingly enough, in the Kickstarter for this game, it does show a glider as a concept. I imagine that's one of the big things from the cutting room floor that really should have been kept. The closest thing to any sort of movement finesse this game has is actually pretty interesting, but inconsequential. I'll go through it anyways. This is a pretty nice, unique touch. So imagine in a Mario game where you jump up onto a platform that's higher than you, and then imagine that you just land on the platform when you're trying to go to it. You don't jump up, you're higher than the platform, so you have to land on it for a second. There's no landing. You just jump and then you're just on the platform. Sort of like a no impact land if you're a Smash Brothers fan. That idea is in this game. If you jump up onto sort of rocks, platforms, you just sort of warp onto them, and it feels kind of nice and fluid, but the game doesn't really utilize it in any way, so it's kind of like, it's just there. Combat is another thing in this game that could have used maybe a little more time in the oven. It tries to do Dark Souls style combat, which is not what I'm particularly a fan of, at least right now. So it does sort of the slow animations, you know, variety of moves thing. And from practice, I ended up not using all the moves the game gave me. I just used the basic swings and kicks. It didn't seem that fluid to react to enemy attacks. You know, the enemies sort of wind up, they have their, you know, attack patterns that will knock you out of your attacks. Maybe that's partly just the Dark Souls style not being my thing. In addition, this game seems to suffer the problem Breath of the Wild has, where you also have a bow to use, and the bow headshots is just the strongest thing. You don't even have to bother with doing anything else, which maybe was good for me, because I didn't have to use the sword combat as much, but I don't know, it's kind of like a balancing thing. I guess also, going back to the Breath of the Wild comparisons, I'm really using these Breath of the Wild comparisons, despite saying this game's not like Breath of the Wild. But there's different arrow types to use. There's actually kind of interesting ideas for arrows, so one of them's like better just for headshots, but worse for body shots, one that's better for body shots, and then there's explosive arrows. There's not a good way to switch arrows, which is really puzzling. You just have to go into the menu, scroll over to your equipable items, then equip the arrow, and then exit the menu. It's weird having to do it. It's like, why did they do it that way? Overall, I feel combat was okay in this game, just it feels a little prolonged. I just don't like the slowness. And enemies seem to be, like, tanky to a bit, too, like, added to the prolonged feeling. Combat variety is also a little limited, so you're mostly just going to be swinging with the sword, shooting with the bow. There's a few other little things you can do, so you can put down one of two different trap types, but one of them is not even actually a combat trap, it just makes enemies drop their items. And then you can also put down an explosive barrel, but there's a bit of sort of startup time for putting down these items. I guess maybe coming from the Dark Souls influence, so you're going to get hit if you try to use them sort of deep in a melee situation. So you're going to wind up not using those a lot, essentially. In addition, combat maybe suffered not just from its mechanics, but also the enemies. There's not really that much enemy variety. There's only one single enemy creature in the overworld, instead of a huge variety, which I felt probably should have been done. The really different enemies that are in the game are just the 5 different animal factions. Each animal faction has their own fighting style. Some of them are more annoying than the rest. So the animal factions being enemies adds up to a total of 6 different enemy types in the game. There's not even any boss encounters, however, it does seem like the devs realized they couldn't make a boss fight that was good, which is actually sort of a good thing to know. You know, not every game has to have boss fights if you can't make a good boss fight especially. But then they kinda did. So I guess a little bit of spoilers here. In one quest there's just enemies set up to be a boss fight, but it's just a regular tribe animal, but with more health. You know, doing it once maybe to communicate to the player, hey, we kinda wanted to have boss fights, but we really can't make them. Like, this is showing why. Like, oh, fair enough, but they do it twice for some reason. I don't know why. Just looking at the whole game, the main thing that's going to be driving you to play through it is not necessarily the main quest, at least for me looking back, but rather the exploration, collecting items for crafting, and village relation aspects, despite the fact that the main quest is the only quest in the game, really. The main quest will drive you to interact with it, though, and complete it, since it facilitates you through 3 different vaults in the game, which, upon completion of each one, gives you some sort of different item that lets you interact with the world differently. Sort of like a Zelda game or Banjo-Tooie, just to not only refer to Zelda. Now, I'm gonna have this little spoiler section here labeled. There will be a spoiler end section, sort of noted in the timestamps as well as visually, just so if you want to go into the game more blind, that's possible. But I want to talk about the items and how that sort of impacts the game. So the way this main quest with the items work causes a very lopsided flow of the game, where the most interesting part of the game, where the most things are possible, is like the last 25% or so. In the beginning of the game, you have to pick one of 3 vaults in the game of your choosing. There is no set order of items you gain. However, you cannot do the next 2 vaults until a long part of the main quest completes. Which after that, you can then do both vaults right after another, and then it's just the ending part of the main quest. This causes a weird progression through the world where you can only interact with one set of puzzle areas that require just one item. There are areas that require multiple. But otherwise, you can't do the rest of them until the end of the game, basically. In addition, my playthrough maybe got even extra scuffed because of this. The first item I got was arguably the worst. It's an item, a shocker, that lets me interact with a few things in the world. Lets me use it in combat, but it's not that good in combat. The other 2 items that I got later were way more interesting. There's an animal tamer item and a scanner for both the world and objects. And both of these impact how you traverse the world way better. The animal tamer lets you tame the enemy creature to use it in combat, lets you get a mount. Scanner lets you see everything sort of on the map in icons, so it makes exploring a little more rewarding. So both of these are much more dramatic changes to how you play the game, and I didn't get them till the very end, so that was definitely kind of annoying, because I had to kind of go back through the world with these items again. So that leads to me to recommend, if you want to look up a walkthrough too, I would recommend probably getting the scanner item first, if you want to be able to fully explore every area as you go through it the first time. Otherwise, get the tamer item first if you'd rather have the mount and the ability to have one of the enemies fight along with you. And both of those will probably give you a better experience throughout the game. Okay, so now I have to get into the bugs. There are bugs, so many bugs in this game. It's an indie dev studio's first effort, so it's understandable where they come from, but they are still in the game, and they impact the experience a lot. I noticed there were bugs frequently interfering with game progress and flow throughout this game. I had to redo an animal village raid 3 times, was the most egregious example. So there's a quest where you need to raid a village for one of your allied animal tribes. I did get it to work the first time, but the game's had a weird decision-making thing where it still had an enemy on screen as the quest ended, so I died, not to the enemy actually, but to friendly fire right as the quest finished, because there was a cutscene that interrupted. Then after I respawned, the quest kind of bugged out, and I kept raiding that same village. It didn't count, and then I realized I had to raid a different village the game was marking all of a sudden, but only showed up after I raided the first village the game originally wanted me to raid, and then I could complete the quest. Yeah, that's a little confusing, a little weird to follow. The other egregious examples I found were the game kind of just locked up after I completed one of the vaults, and the game froze up in loading screens as well. There are a lot of other little things where you'll just have to go back and reload a save, or just save, exit the game, load back, that happen as well, like some little audio bugs and stuff. Just be on the lookout for some bugs. If these bugs were fixed, that would probably eliminate an extra few hours off the game time that aren't needed. On a more positive note, though, updates do seem to have improved things in terms of bugs. This game came out in 2019. I played it, this year in 2020. There was an update like a month ago before I played it that fixed a bunch of bugs, so depending on when you play the game, a majority of these bugs may even be fixed. And here's some things that are more better left as just side notes that I don't really feel are worth mentioning for that much. So, the presentation of this game, it's okay, it's serviceable, but it's not amazing. Same with the music. You're gonna find there's a lot of different things going on in this game, but there's a lot of concepts that just don't have a lot of depth to them. I didn't really find the story of this game that compelling. The story in this game felt like a cartoon to me. It's not really a major draw for me in most games anyways. If the game's not about story, it doesn't set itself out to be that way. One funny thing I'll note is sort of the main character is literally basically a blank slate. He doesn't have any drive of his own, but what does cause him to do anything is that his brother wants to do stuff, so he just does it because his brother wants to. In addition, this game has a stamina system that winds up kind of working more like a hunger system. It's not really explained that well what it does, it just sort of shows icons that relate to what full stamina gives you, but you have to eat frequently throughout the game to get your stamina back up. There's also no stealth element to this game. They implemented crouching and it does kind of impact stealth. There's like question mark icons that the enemies have, but it doesn't really work well. It's not really impactful because there's no backstab or anything. It just wound up not really mattering or existing in this game. Although it was refreshing to not just stealth around in an open world game for once. Okay, and now it's time to talk about the technical details. So I have the main menu open for this. We're going to go into the settings. It's a PC game, and it does a pretty good settings menu, although it is a Unity game. So you can see you can turn off screen shake. This auto aim setting actually I had on, but I didn't really notice it for the controller. I would recommend a controller for this game. If we go under graphics, there's a decent amount of options, especially for a Unity game. You still have the Unity presets here, though. Notice I only have it on good. If I try to crank it to max, the game basically caps out at 60 FPS. I imagine there's like optimization issues. I've seen optimization issues in other open world Unity games. So I did turn it down to good. And see, I have all these things turned off in order to get the game to run at about 70 to 90 FPS. So yeah, if you're looking for high refresh rate, 144 Hz and above, this game's probably not going to give you that unless you want to turn things down really low. If you're on like a more mid-range system, you're also going to have to tweak to get 60 FPS. There's just a bit of optimization issues. Once again, it's an indie studio's first outing. Look in audio, we got the different audio sliders you'd expect. There's just music and sounds, no dialogue. There's not really a lot of dialogue in the game. And if we go to controls, there's full controller rebinding settings, so that's pretty good. I would recommend we go under, let's see, it's under general here actually. So use active outfinding. I don't have a controller plugged in, but the default controller button for this is left D-pad actually, which you would need to use this item like sort of on the field as you're running in combat. So it's not a really good bind. What I set it to was X on the controller, which is change weapon by default. And then I put change weapon on clicking the stick in. And clicking the stick in by default is crouching, but I mentioned before, stealth in this game is non-existent, so just having it unbound is probably fine, but I bound it to D-pad left. Just basically use active outfinding. If you're using a controller, put it on a face button or something. You'll thank me later. So overall, would I recommend Pine? Well, if you weren't turned off by the fact that I compared it to Far Cry, if the village mechanics sounded interesting, if you aren't burned out of open world games, then yes, I would definitely put it on Steam wishlist. Buy it when it's on sale. Even at a just slight discount, the full retail price is $25 US. I think that's somewhat reasonable. Even a slight discount, I just feel better about. That's just sort of me. I always buy Steam games on sale. This game definitely shows some potential. Maybe if these developers make another open world game, maybe introduce some concepts that you can see on their Kickstarter page that weren't implemented. The glider was the biggest one that I saw. There's also this animal evolution idea that wasn't implemented. There were 2 other different items as well, a flamethrower and a climbing axe. Also the idea of implementing weather, which actually explains an item in the game called a storm rumor. However, weather did suck in Breath of the Wild, so maybe that was okay to cut. But anyways, this is it for this review. Subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. I'm also trying to keep tech videos in mind. I'm trying to sort of have a consistent idea of what types of videos go on this channel. If you look at my back catalog, it's really eclectic. I think it all does represent me, but I want to keep things in a slightly more narrower scope. But probably tech, gaming videos. Those are the 2 things you're gonna find on this channel. And yeah, thanks for watching, and take care.